Welcome to Emerging Civil War. I'm Chris Mackowski. Glad to have you with us. And tonight we're going to get into the weeds at Antietam. A few nights ago, we had the pleasure to do a piece for the American Battlefield Trust. We'll post a link for that when we get this up online, that talked about the Antietam campaign. And at the end of it, my good friend Kevin Pawlak said, gosh, I'd love to get into the weeds about some of that stuff. And I said, I'd love to let you get into the weeds about some of that stuff. So tonight we're going to get into the weeds. Let me introduce my colleagues, a great panel of historians to talk with you tonight. First, my ECW co-founder, Kris White. Kris is the education manager at the American Battlefield Trust. He's the co-author of several thousand books. He's done some great work with me. Always glad to have him. Kris, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Kevin Pawlak is a licensed battlefield guide at Antietam National Battlefield. He's also the site supervisor at the Bristow Station Battlefield, as well as Ben Lomond Historic Site in Prince William County. And he's the author or co-author of the book To Hazard All, a guide to the Maryland campaign of 1862, which he co-authored with the infamous Rob Orison. And then finally, joining us from Gettysburg is my good friend Dan Vermilya. Dan is a park ranger for the National Park Service, stationed at Eisenhower, which I think is one of the greatest time capsules in the entire National Park Service. It's a fantastic site. Dan is the author of That Field of Blood, part of the Emerging Civil War series, concentrating on the Battle of Antietam. Dan has also authored books on James Garfield in the Civil War and on the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Fellas, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm going to kick things off with Kris and ask him to kind of set the table for us as we get ready for the single bloodiest day in American history.
Anytime I hear the term infamous, all I can think about is Three Amigos, and I'm going to call you El Guapo all night because he's infamous. That's more than famous. So anyways, thanks, Kris. To talk very briefly, to bring us up to Maryland in 1862, what you're looking at on the screen is a map from the American Battlefield Trust. You know, the war in the East and the war in the West in late 1862 are really kind of mirroring one another. Although there are more Union victories out in the West throughout most of 1862, both the Union armies in Kentucky and in Virginia and in Maryland are both basically playing to the Confederates' tune. There's a long, drawn-out campaign that will eventually come to fruition in early October at Perryville in central Kentucky, and that will be the height of a Confederate offensive that went on, the Heartland Offensive that will go on for many months and cover many thousands of miles as the two sides go back and forth across the Deep South and then into the Upper South. Now, in the Eastern Theater, the things had started off well in 1862. The Union Army, the Potomac, under George McClellan, had moved from Washington, D.C. down to the tip of the Virginia Peninsula and then made its way towards the Confederate capital of Richmond. Once about 8 miles away from Richmond, a fortuitous event will occur, and that will be the wounding of Joseph Johnston, the Confederate commander in that area, which will lead to the rise of Robert E. Lee. Lee will take over what he dubs the Army of Northern Virginia, and in late June and into early July, he will instigate the 7 days battles. 6 battles really over 7 days. And what will come of this will be the fact that the Confederates will take the operational initiative away from the Union Army in the East. From there, what Lee wants to do after wrestling away this initiative, he is going to take the war away from the Confederate capital. Richmond accounts for about 40% of all the Confederacy's manufacturing goods and needs, and there's all kinds of railroads coming into into Richmond, as well as Petersburg. So what Lee wants to do is get the armies away from that area. He'll eventually move up into central Virginia. There'll be a battle in August of 1862 at Cedar Mountain, which will then lead to the next battle in line, which will be Second Manassas and then Chantilly. And then in early September, Lee will take his army across the Potomac River and into Maryland. And his idea here is going to be to threaten Washington and hopefully move up into Pennsylvania towards Harrisburg, which is the state capital, as well as a major rail center, and will be key to the upcoming midterm elections that we'll be seeing here in November of 1862. So what Lee is going to do is turn the war in the East on its ear by taking the war from Richmond all the way up across the Potomac River up to Washington. And in that range, you're going to go flip the script about 100 miles. So go from Richmond, which is about 100 miles away from Washington, up to the area around Frederick, Maryland, and around Harper's Ferry, Virginia at the time, and West Virginia today. So this will be a tough campaign on the Confederates. They go from about 92,500 men at the outset of the 7 days. By the time they cross the Potomac River into Maryland, they have less than 40,000 or so men. The numbers are very subjective. On the other side, the Union Army is actually a collection of Union armies coming together around Washington. Abraham Lincoln had created an Army of Virginia. That army was defeated alongside the Army of the Potomac at the Second Battle of Manassas. These armies will come streaming back towards Washington. They'll be reconstituted and march out as the Army of the Potomac as they go out to try to do battle with Robert E. Lee, with George McClellan at the head of the army.
So lots going on, huge pendulum shift, and the Federals are really having to kind of react still to Lee's tune. But as things converge on, as the Union converges on Frederick, Maryland, and George McClellan is trying to read the tea leaves, something important happens that tries to offer some clarity for him. Kevin, can you talk just a little bit about what's going on in McClellan's head as he's trying to figure out what Lee is up to?
Yeah, as McClellan's making his way towards Frederick, as you can see on the map here, he's moving his army basically in three columns, a left, a center, and a right. The right wing under Ambrose Burnside approaches Frederick first, but McClellan, when he's riding with Sumner's center wing of the army, approaches Frederick. On the 13th, two soldiers from Indiana, 27th Indiana, will stumble upon a lost copy of Lee's Special Orders number 191. 191 has created all sorts of controversy, debate among historians. Was it important for McClellan to have found? Was it not? And nonetheless, what McClellan was really faced with was that he knew from his cavalry and local sources that the Confederate Army had vacated Frederick several days earlier. But the intelligence that McClellan was receiving told him two things: that the Confederates were moving south towards Harper's Ferry, which would indicate a re-entry of the Confederate Army into Virginia. And then also he received reports that the Confederate Army was likewise moving north towards Hagerstown, which, trying to piece that together in anybody's mind, you're trying to figure out what are these two divergent wings of the Confederate Army doing, and what's the real movement, what is the ruse, so to speak. So finding Special Orders number 191 at least solidifies in McClellan's mind. I think it was something he was already on the path of figuring out, but it solidifies in his mind that, or why at least, Robert E. Lee has divided the Army of Northern Virginia in Maryland. Special Orders 191, though, is also going to create a little bit of a fog of war for George McClellan. When McClellan is handed the lost copy, the orders are 4 days old at this point. They were written on September 9th. So McClellan has to figure out if the orders are still up to date, so to speak. The other thing that creates a bit of fog of war for him is that the copy that was lost, written out to Daniel Harvey Hill, one of Lee's division commanders, begins with paragraph number 3, and each of the paragraphs are numbered. And so the question certainly must have lingered in McClellan's mind and anybody's mind that saw this document of what is in paragraphs 1 and 2. Today, with hindsight, we can go back and look at it and realize paragraphs 1 and 2 basically have nothing to do with Lee's operational plans in Maryland and to seize Harper's Ferry. But nonetheless, the first thing McClellan does with Special Orders 191 is to send out his cavalry to verify that Lee's army is divided. Once he does that, then he's able to come up with a plan of attack to strike Lee's divided army at South Mountain the next day on September 14th.
And Dan, I want to just ask you real quickly to weigh in on Special Order 191, because it is a great topic for armchair generaling. There are divergent opinions about the importance of Special Order 191. What do you think about it?
So I think it's one of these perfect things in history that gives us an opportunity, as you said, Chris, to be these armchair generals, to look at it and try to, gauge what we would have done in that situation. For a long time, we have not had the full picture on what Special Orders 191 actually was. And I think Kevin just did a really nice job on laying out the specifics of what it told McClellan. It's not giving him this crystal clear, high definition photograph of what the Confederate Army looks like and where they're going and what their intentions are. If anything, it's some sort of like a blurry watercolor painting with vagueness that he's trying to pick up on and make sense of this, because he's being told all these different figures on how many soldiers the Confederate has. the Confederate Army has. And at the end of the day, he's only as good as what he's being given information-wise, intelligence-wise. I think that a lot of it is, I think we make a big deal out of it because McClellan has that kind of a reputation. With Kevin and I both on here, you're going to get a lot of different takes on McClellan this evening, I think. But and that's good. That's a good thing.
That's good.
But I think a lot of it, more has been made of it than what it was. It was not even the only time in that campaign where orders fell into the other army's headquarters, the hands of the other army. So it is not a solo thing. It's not the only time this ever happened. And there's also a lot of debate about when McClellan gets these orders and how quickly he moves on them, whether it's a delay of 18 hours or 6 hours, or a lot of debate about when he's sending his messages to Washington saying, I have the plans of the enemy and I shall beat him in detail. The big thing to keep in mind is this is a guy who a week earlier left Washington, D.C. with an army he had built in 5 days, composed of 5 different army groups. He does not know some of the commanders he's working with. There are a lot of new uncertainties that Lee does not have to face because Lee is working with these same guys. So McClellan gets these, it gives him a basic idea of what's going on. And the very next day, he's moving against Confederates at South Mountain.
So, and I think it's important to realize, too, that McClellan was not Lincoln's first choice, but on the other hand, he was Lincoln's really only choice available. So there's sort of this grudging promotion of McClellan into this position in the first place. And Little Mac, who's been under fire because of things at the peninsula, really kind of steps up and moves with surprising speed and alacrity. Chris, let me swing back to you because as McClellan moves out of Frederick in response to this. We end up having some actions at Harper's Ferry, South Mountain, Longstreet, way up by Hagerstown. What's happening in these tumultuous few days right after McClellan starts to pursue?
Well, you have a number of engagements. You'll have one of the reasons why, as Kevin pointed out, Lee has to send a detachment of his army to Harper's Ferry is simply the size of the Union detachment that is stationed there. Harper's Ferry, like Winchester and Virginia, will famously change hands numerous times throughout the American Civil War. But Harper's Ferry is at this point a supply center. It's also contains about 13 to 14,000 Union soldiers. So this is not an insubstantial amount of soldiers who could potentially be in Lee's rear should he keep pushing north towards Hagerstown, should he push across the Mason-Dixon line. To put it in perspective, that's about 1/3 of the size of Lee's army here during this campaign. So you have to take care of Harper's Ferry. Now, a lot of these soldiers are green. They're not particularly well led, but that doesn't matter. That's still a threat, and they could reinforce McClellan's army at any point. So to protect essentially Jackson as he starts to envelop Harper's Ferry, or invest Harper's Ferry, you're going to have to protect the Pleasant Valley, which will lead you down to Harper's Ferry. And to do so, Lee will man the gaps at Fox's, Turner's, and Crampton's. These gaps, known as in the South Mountain chain, will come on September 14th to be known as the Battle of South Mountain. The next day, Harper's Ferry will fall. So in quick succession, you have essentially 4 independent actions. The battles at Fox's, Turner's, and Crampton's Gap on the 14th, the actions at Harper's Ferry. Once Harper's Ferry falls, which is the largest surrender of United States forces until the Second World War, you now give Lee a free hand to start moving to wherever he needs to react to McClellan's maneuvers or to potentially keep moving north. What he has to do is now consolidate the army, which he decides to do on the banks of the Potomac River near Sharpsburg, because McClellan is actually moving more aggressively than he normally does. Is it because of Special Orders 191? Possibly. And is it because he's just in such close proximity to the enemy? That could be it as well. Regardless, McClellan's going to move a little bit more quickly than he normally does. And that is going to threaten Lee's line of retreat into Virginia, and is also going to threaten his line of advance up across the Mason-Dixon line.
I think one of the things, too, that's of concern to Lee, not only because he has his army divided into so many parts, but he has a much smaller army at this point than he has had in quite some time. Kevin, tell me a little bit about the size of the armies as things start to coalesce around the banks of the Antietam Creek.
Well, as a historian, I'm not good at math, so let me preface that. And, of course, Civil War arithmetic is a very inexact science. And so numbers have been argued about quite a bit. You're not going to grade me. That's good. The highest estimates, at least for the Confederate Army, I'll let Dan talk a little bit more about the numbers for the Union Army. He's done a lot of work with that. But some estimates say as high as, or as many as 65 to 70,000 Confederates entered Maryland beginning on September 4th through the 6th. By the time Lee's army gets to the banks of Antietam Creek and his army is gathered up on the morning of September 17th, he has perhaps no more than 40,000 men.
Wow.
So that's a loss of, if you do the math there, 25 to 30,000 soldiers. And looking at
where are those soldiers going? Are they stopping off at the 7-Eleven for Slurpees? Are they going back home? What happens to 30,000 guys?
Yeah, looking at Confederate battle casualties at South Mountain and Harper's Ferry, it's just a shade over 3,000. So this is, now you have to account for 20,000 plus men. That's, where do they go, is the big question. And I think a lot of it is that you have to think both armies, as Chris mentioned at the start, these armies have been marching and fighting continuously basically for the last 90 days. And they have reached, I think, just both Union and Confederate soldiers reached the limits of human exertion. And these guys are just falling out by the wayside. And I don't believe that this is, dissatisfaction of Confederates invading the North or anything like that. It is just these guys are exhausted. They fall out by the wayside. And within literally days after the Battle of Antietam, the strength of Lee's army, the paper strength, is back up over 60,000 men.
And let's talk about the federal side there.
Yeah, so this is another one of those classic staples of the Maryland campaign that for so long has been used to convict George McClellan of being an inept commander. This whole narrative that he had 2 times or even 3 times the number that Robert E. Lee had at Antietam. And the official reports say that in McClellan's own report, he says he had 87,000 men. In a report that's in the McClellan papers in the Library of Congress, he says 101,000 men. Neither of those are true. I don't think McClellan knew how many men he had at Antietam, and I don't think that that's actually that unusual. I don't think Lee knew how many men he had at Antietam because of the short time in between that battle and Second Manassas. As McClellan is leaving Washington, just as Kevin described with the Confederates, he is losing men as well, simply because the army is weary. He's just recombined these forces. He's dealing with a lot of straggling as well. There are different reports being sent out. Even the day before the battle on September 16th, there are units from the Federal Ninth Corps who are sending parties behind the lines to try to round up stragglers. Best case scenario, he's starting the day at Antietam with probably about 54,000 men in his army there. Now he's going to have more arriving throughout the day. The 6th Corps is going to arrive, parts of the 5th Corps arriving from nearby. So his troop strength is going to go up a little bit. But throughout the day at Antietam on the 17th of September, at no point does McClellan really have more than 60,000 men on hand at any one time. Overall, maybe about 70,000 or more. But when you think about what's actually happening, as guys are arriving, they're not adding to his total strength. They're replacing combat losses, especially from the cornfield. And then this army that he does have, it is not a well-oiled fighting machine. Just a couple quick things, in the Army of Northern Virginia, 60% of the soldiers had been in 3 or more major battles. For the Union Army of the Potomac, it's 10% or fewer who had been in that many battles. 1 out of every 4 of McClellan's soldiers had never been in combat before. This is an untested army in some ways. Of his brigade commanders, in combat itself during the Civil War, brigade leaders are the ones who are making some very important decisions that are dictating the flow of these battles. In the Army of the Potomac, 29% of the brigade commanders had experience. Only 29% had experience leading a brigade before, whereas for the Army of Northern Virginia, it was 75%. So Confederates definitely have the edge in experience. Union Army has the edge in numbers, though not by as much as is typically stated. It's much more of a 3-2 advantage than a 2-1 or 3-1 advantage.
So, Chris, as these armies are starting to coalesce around Sharpsburg, one of the things I find amazing is that Lee chooses to coalesce in Sharpsburg in the first place. Tell me a little bit about Lee's choice of a ground to defend and why he decides to pick that battlefield.
Yeah, Lee has good access to the rear across the Potomac River. He can escape into Virginia if he needs to. And he's on some bends in the Potomac River. So if he uses these bends properly, he can properly defend his position if he has to fall back towards it. He has Antietam Creek towards his front. He also has Heights to his left, Nicodemus Heights, and he has the interior lines. Interior lines are everything into Civil War armies. This is something that Antoine-Henri Jomini always tells everyone that you should have. He's the leading military thinker at this time. We're not reading Karl von Clausewitz yet because we haven't actually translated him yet to English. So we're not teaching him. We're teaching these French fighting tactics. So he has the ability to fall back into Virginia if he needs to, which then could potentially go upstream or downstream, as it were, using the Potomac River to cross either below McClellan or above. And he can do this. And as Kevin will probably talk about towards the end, that's exactly what he's going to think about doing once he withdraws from Antietam. So it's not a terrible defensive position. He has clear fields of fire. He has natural defensive positions with the sunken road, as we'll see. But, he's definitely outnumbered for sure. It's not the best of positions with the river to your back. And Lee at this point is questioned by a lot of his subordinates of why he stays here and fights it out, especially after the battle. Mind you, hindsight's 20/20, but there are a lot of officers, including his staff officers, who are a little bit upset that he actually stayed, especially after the 17th, and basically dared McClellan to attack him again. So Lee's also riding just this wave of victories, one after another after another. And this is coming off the fact that Lee, prior to this, was thought of, and I know it's sacrilege to say throughout the South, but as a loser. In early 1861, he had not done well in Western Virginia. He sacked, doesn't understand these politics of this volunteer army, and is backstabbed, sent back to Richmond. He's sent to the Southeast, where he's working with some of the worst governors in the Confederacy to deal with personality-wise. They don't like him. They ship him back to Richmond, and Jefferson Davis doesn't know what to do with this guy. Now that he takes over the Army of Northern Virginia, which was controversial, men like James Longstreet and Jeb Stuart didn't think highly of Lee whenever he took over this army. Now that he's gained that initiative, he wants to keep it. And I think that's what he's doing here. He's going to go for broke at Antietam and throughout this entire campaign, which is essentially one battle after another. And that's going to wear out the armies, as Kevin and Dan pointed out. These armies aren't built for the sustained style of campaigning and combat like you would see during the time of Napoleon or Winfield Scott Drive on Mexico City.
And I think, too, that Lee's encounters with McClellan down on the peninsula, observing as Davis's military advisor and kind of watching from behind the scenes, and then during the 7 Days battle, I think Lee's got a pretty good measure of McClellan. And I think he feels bold enough to put up a stand against McClellan, thinking that, he's going to kind of psych McClellan out a little bit. Does that strategy actually work, Kevin? Does McClellan get psyched out by the fact that Lee's taking a stand here?
I think there's enough source material to indicate that at least at McClellan's headquarters, now whether George McClellan himself felt this way or not, but certainly some members of McClellan's staff did. I think they were a bit surprised to see Lee standing behind the Antietam on September 15th. Granted, I don't think there was time for the Federals to attack on September 15th, but come the morning of the 16th, when the Army of the Potomac is a bit more coalesced around the banks, the east bank of Antietam Creek, there's a heavy fog on the morning of the 16th that really prevents any view. Some soldiers that were witness to it said that you could barely see 10 feet in front of you. And that fog didn't burn off until about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. And I think there was, again, some feeling that Lee might be gone. Might have used the cover of the night and the fog to be gone, but come, again, mid-morning of September 16th and Lee is still there, then McClellan really starts to put a plan in motion. And his plan is ultimately to attack. And it's the second time in the last 3 days that McClellan has moved his men in motion to attack Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and Maryland.
Which is counter to what he had done on the peninsula, which is playing against what Lee would probably be expecting, because McClellan throughout the peninsula just gave way to Robert E. Lee. And Lee, even though he sustained higher casualties than McClellan's army, McClellan played to Lee's tune throughout that time. So I think that has to play into Lee's mind as he's standing there saying, come on, let's pick a fight here.
Dan, your take on it?
I think that, McClellan is operating with some basic strategic assumptions for the campaign. And every decision that he makes tactically is thinking towards those assumptions, knowing that, okay, maybe Lee is still there, but as long as he's on Maryland soil, my job is to try to end this campaign somehow. I guess he was perhaps a little bit, I don't know if surprised by Lee making that stand there. But, as Kevin said, it's a couple times, twice in the matter of just a few days that McClellan is mobilizing his army and sending them forward. And I think his plan at Antietam is going to be adapted to that terrain that Lee's on, to really the best he can, trying to get, at minimum, at best, just get Lee out of Maryland and, maybe hopefully potentially something more, destroying Lee's army.
I think that's a really important point to make, because after the battle, McClellan sees it as an outright success, because as he had defined the parameters, he was supposed to just get Lee out of Maryland. Does that, it's a big win. But a lot of armchair generaling on that, like, should he have done more? Should he have gone after Lee? So that we can kind of get into that at the end of the discussion here. Kevin and Dan, you've both talked about McClellan's preparations to attack. We get to the morning of the 17th, that's going to happen. And before we kind of get into the attacks themselves, I want to sort of talk about and ask you guys about the popular interpretation of Antietam, where we tend to think of the battle in phases. There's the morning phase at the north end of the field, the cornfield around the Dunker Church. Then later on, we're going to shift over toward the Sunken Road, and then later down to the Burnside Bridge. Is that it's certainly a useful way to look at the battle, but is that the right way to look at the battle?
I'll jump on this one, Kevin. I think the phases have for a very long time been the prevalent view that the morning phase of the battle was the cornfield, the midday phase, so to speak, was the Sunken Road, and the afternoon phase was the Burnside Bridge. To put it simply, the timeframes don't make sense. The Sunken Road fighting was not in the middle of the day. It started at about 9:30 in the morning. The Burnside Bridge fighting took place starting at 10 o'clock in the morning. That's not in the afternoon. I think it's much better to view it as a northern phase of the battle and a southern phase of the battle. Chris, I don't know if you have one of those handy maps you can throw up on the screen for us. But basically, everything that's happening north of the Boonesboro Turnpike, the attacks in the cornfield, the east woods, the west woods, kind of what you're seeing in this map here, the cornfield attacks, even down to the Sunken Road as well. These are all attacks against, all attacks against the left side, the left flank of Lee's army by the right flank of the Union Army. Almost like successive blows being thrown against him, trying to hammer that flank of the Confederate left. Whereas what's happening on the southern end of the field, south of the Boonesboro Turnpike, where the Burnside Bridge is, the lower bridge, and ultimately the final attack on the afternoon of the 17th, that's a separate southern phase of the battle. While McClellan's hammering Lee's left all morning on the 17th, he's trying to get this attack going against the southern end of the Confederate line, trying to stagger these blows against the Confederates. I think that's a much more accurate summation of McClellan's thinking. Granted, he's giving these orders piecemeal. There's no one fully written out battle plan, which is a criticism of McClellan at Antietam. Certainly, I'm more pro-McClellan than others, but I will admit he does have some flaws. So there's no perfect, well-written-out plan. But I think seeing it as northern phases and southern phases of the battle is much more accurate than this disjointed three-phase view. So I'm not sure if Kevin or Chris want to weigh in on that, but that's my interpretation at least.
Yeah, I'll say something real quick about the phases. I mean, you look at 9:30 in the morning, when, as Dan said, you're supposed to have morning, midday, and afternoon phase. 9:30 in the morning, there's fighting going on in the West Woods. The Federal attacks on the Sunken Road are just beginning, and Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps is mobilizing to begin its assaults on the southern end of the battlefield. And then come 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 17th, you have one straight line of Union soldiers stretching all the way from south of the Burnside Bridge to the North Woods on the battlefield. And so McClellan has finally, I think, by that point in the battle, achieved one of his objectives of creating the solid mass of blue on the west side of the Antietam that's supposed to operate as one army rather than these independent commands trying to fight to get across the creek.
I'm not going to lie, looking at the map that Chris just had up with all of the arrows and all of the units, I'm excited to get into the weeds here. Chris, let me ask you to start things off for us in the morning of the 17th as McClellan finally launches these attacks.
Pull up that handy dandy map. So what you're going to see is, as Dan was pointing out, you're starting to see a new army here. Most people who start their war at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863 look and see the First Corps and they say, oh, that's John Reynolds. They're an old standby here in the Army of the Potomac. They're really not. This is a new addition that's going to come into the fold with the Army to actually serve with them. The First Corps was not down on the peninsula. They were up around Fredericksburg, and then you're going to fold elements of the old Army of Virginia under John Pope into this. So as Dan pointed out, you're going to have a mishmash of new commanders working with new commanders. Joe Hooker is a newly promoted Corps commander. I think he's probably one of the hardest hitters on the field, great at division level command, great at Corps level command. He'll start it out across the Poffenberger Farm and head down into what becomes David Miller's famous cornfield. The attacks going essentially from north to south using the Hagerstown Turnpike as its axis of advance is a easy way to follow this. And I think that's one of the reasons why people like to put it into those phases more than the actual reality of when the battle took place. So I think that's what you kind of run into. This is a more palatable battle for some people. But what you're seeing here is Joe Hooker moving from north to south. He's going to hit Stonewall Jackson. Jackson has just arrived back in this area from Harper's Ferry, or arrived in this area from Harper's Ferry. His men are largely exhausted, being the fact that he had been the lead horse to go from the peninsula to Cedar Mountain to Second Manassas and then across the Potomac and take Harper's Ferry. Jackson works very well independently, and his men have been a little bit worn out because they have done so much fighting, and especially marching through the heat of August and now into September. So Jackson's men are going to meet Hooker's men around the cornfield. It's going to be really a slugging match along the Hagerstown Turnpike. The famed Iron Brigade, who's just earned their name at South Mountain, will engage with some Louisiana troops down along the Hagerstown Turnpike, which will come up with some of the most famous photographs of the battle along the Hagerstown Turnpike, where the Iron Brigade almost envelops Stark's brigade up along the West Woods area. The fighting itself will be a seesaw action, with Jackson piecemeal throwing brigades and divisions at this point are really the size of sometimes brigade level because of how worn out these Confederate units are. But you're starting to see Hooker initiate this battle. But what you're not seeing on this map yet are any other Federal units. The Union 12th Army Corps will arrive in this sector, as will the Union 2nd Army Corps. So this is going to start to take on a life of its own as they start to fight around or near the Dunker Church into the West Woods, East Woods. But this battle that started to take place around 6 o'clock in the morning on September 17th, Wednesday, September 17th, will be in this cornfield, and it will start with some of the famous units, or soon to be famous units. And you'll have the Pennsylvania Reserves, who are coming down through here, commanded by George Gordon Meade. Hooker, unfortunately, in this action will be wounded in the foot and knocked out of action, as will the 12th Army Corps Commander Joseph K. Mansfield. Mansfield is mortally wounded. So as the Union Army starts their day, they're going to lose two of their Corps commanders, which is really going to damage their chain of command up on this sector of the battlefield.
And of course, if you were to talk to Joe Hooker, that wound in the foot is what loses the battle for the Federal Army, because certainly had he stayed on the field, he says he would have been able to carry out these orders and these attacks. Kevin, I promised you the opportunity to get into the weeds. I don't know if we're there yet, but I want to at least put you in the corn. You have done lots of tours of the battlefield, the cornfield, one of the most iconic of all Civil War battlefields. Let's get right in there. Tell us what happens in the cornfield.
As I always joke with visitors on tour that we could, for a 3-hour tour, we could stand there in the cornfield for 3 hours and still not get through everything. It's plenty of back and forth action. When Joe Hooker moves forward about 6 o'clock on the morning of September 17th, as Chris mentioned, he's going to use the Hagerstown Pike for Abner Doubleday's division. His axis of advance straight for the famed Dunker Church, of course, is supposedly the objective point that they set out. Really, the church has no military significance, but if they can reach the church, then they can drive the Confederates off the high ground where the visitor center for Antietam National Battlefield sits today. Doubleday is going to move directly south along the Hagerstown Pike. James Ricketts' division is going to move sort of northeast to southwest along the Smoketown Road, and you can see just north of the Dunkard Church, the Hagerstown Pike and Smoketown Roads come square together. However, Hooker is going to find, of course, courtesy of Stonewall Jackson, that the path to the Dunkard Church is not going to be an easy one. Jackson really has almost a salient out in front of the high ground, the Dunkard Church Plateau, to protect that high ground, and it is going to be constant back and forth action between the two sides. I've seen numbers, people try to count how many times the cornfield changes hands, and I say it's impossible to tell. Very difficult to count, but it is just basically Joe Hooker and Stonewall Jackson battling each other to mutual annihilation around the 24 acres of David Miller's cornfield.
Just an absolute slugfest. Dan, I'm going to give you the chance to sort of chime in here in a second. Chris, if I could just ask you to bring up that last map just a second ago, because the yellow triangle in the middle is, of course, jumping out and catching our eyes. And I know that the American Battlefield Trust had some important work to do with that. You want to give a little plug for the work there?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought you asked Dan.
Since you're our American Battlefield Trust guy.
Yeah. This is what we call the epicenter of the battle. It is where, as you'll see over a series of maps, the units from both sides will enter this area, counterattack, back and forth across it. It was actually one of the last pieces of the puzzle to put this battlefield back together. If you stood there about 10 years ago, or should say, if you stood at the visitor center down by Stephen D. Lee's guns and looked northward towards the cornfield, you would see a large old barn, you would see an old house. That is no longer there. They were not historic structures. They were taken down by the trust, and this piece of property will be given to the National Park Service here very shortly, actually.
Oh, fantastic. Dan, anything you want to add about the cornfield just being an iconic place? I know a lot of people have lots of stories and strong feelings about it.
Yeah, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a spot of ground in American military history that, the cornfield really is up there in terms of significance. It is up there when you compare it to a lot of different fights. The cornfield alone had more casualties than the entirety of First Manassas. The entirety of the Battle of South Mountain just 3 days beforehand. It is a perfectly designed killing space. It's the highest terrain on the battlefield. It's about the same height roughly as Nicodemus Heights even. It's bordered by these woodlots that funnel these soldiers into this open plateau, making them perfect targets for Confederate infantry and artillery fire. The quotes from soldiers there are just absolutely incredible. A soldier in the 107th Pennsylvania said after the fight that it looked like buckets of blood had been emptied on the ground, and it would take several heavy rains to wash the stains away. My favorite quote is from a guy, a French immigrant, Private Julius Ribardi of Company K of the 12th Massachusetts, who basically was wounded in the leg, immobilized, caught between the two opposing lines of fire, and he survived. He lived to be 97 years old. He said that he was exposed to the fire of slavery and freedom in the cornfield. And I think it's such a powerful, evocative quote from someone who was literally caught between the battle lines, describing not just the opposing fire, but also the broader context that at Antietam, the nation was literally exposed to these two competing armies fighting for slavery and freedom. It's a very compelling quote because it illustrates the brutality of the cornfield and the consequences of the fight.
Chris has given us lots of cool maps here to look at. Why don't you walk us forward in the action, Mr. White?
Yeah, so what ends up happening is, as you can see, and as Dan and Kevin both pointed out, it's a seesaw action. You start in the morning where you'll see, Alexander Lawton's brigade, Hayes's brigade of Confederates, Juba Early's, Roswell Ripley's guys, all around the epicenter heading north to the northeast, engaging with the Union 1st Army Corps over in the Westwoods. You have a hodgepodge of Confederates as well as Union soldiers. And I think this is a perfect example of two commanders becoming focused on one area. And this is actually to the benefit of Stonewall Jackson. Even though he's going to sustain heavy casualties within his wing of the Army, Hooker's men just keep getting funneled, as Dan said, into one zone. So this is one way to contain a Union corps. You have the threat of Jeb Stuart's horse artillery up on Nicodemus Heights over on the right, or the federal right, which is going to, slow down the Federals as they come to the south. Abner Doubleday always seems to have a problem with Confederate artillery on a flank somewhere. Antietam, Fredericksburg, you can name it. And then you'll have the seesaw action back and forth. You'll see John Bell Hood and his men come up, his division, his very undersized division, charge into the cornfield, sustaining, some of the heaviest casualties on the cornfield, as well as at Antietam, period. These are guys who famously made famous that they hadn't really eaten in about 2 days. They're talking about cooking their meals, getting ready to have their morning breakfast when they're called up into action. And as they do so, they'll hit some of the veteran regiments. As Dan pointed out, the 12th Massachusetts is there. That's the Webster Regiment, named after Daniel Webster from Massachusetts. These are guys who fought along Chin Ridge at 2nd Manassas just a few weeks before. So these are veteran units. These are some of the few veteran units that are going to be going into action here, like Dan pointed out. Then you'll give way to the attack of the Union 12th Corps, starting to add its weight in, coming through the East Woods, and then towards that Dunkirk Church, as Kevin pointed out. The Dunkirk Church is a great visual piece on the battlefield for the Union soldiers to at least say, hey, go get that piece of land. And it's a great plateau where Stephen Lee's guns are set up. And at one point, there's so much artillery fire in the area, they're going to call it artillery hell, according to one officer. So you're seeing the size and scope starting to take over. But Mansfield and Hooker, the 1st and 12th Corps commanders for the Union Army, will go down, both Hooker wounded, Mansfield mortally wounded.
One of the things that just kind of amazes me looking at these maps here is we saw really strong defensive lines the Confederates were offering early in the fight. And now look how sparse the Confederate position is looking at this point in the battle. Let me ask you guys, Mansfield goes down. So it's sort of an X factor in the battle. How important is the loss of Mansfield for the Federal Army?
Well, Mansfield had only taken command of the 12th Corps officially just 2 days prior. On September 15th, and while he's often portrayed as somebody who has never led troops in battle before, that's not exactly true, but he had never commanded the likes of 7,000 plus soldiers before on a battlefield. And I'm big about diving into the chemistry that these commanders have with the men underneath them, not just their subordinate officers, but also the regiments and how the different brigades and divisions operate. And so Mansfield has no chance whatsoever to be able to learn how the 12th Corps operates. And the 12th Corps is one that was battered at Cedar Mountain, formerly the 2nd Corps, Army of Virginia under Nathaniel Banks. It was battered at Cedar Mountain, and about half of the troops in the 12th Corps on September 17th are soldiers that have never been in action before. In fact, in many cases, they have been in the Army for just about 2 or 3 weeks up to this point. And there are instances about 10 days before the Battle of Antietam, the colonel of the 128th Pennsylvania, Samuel Crosdale, has to ask Ezra Carman, colonel of the 13th New Jersey and future historian of the Battle of Antietam, what the orders are to deploy his men from column into line. And so the 12th Corps is really just a mess, and Mansfield goes down so early that it's very difficult to tell what impact his wounding ultimately had on the battle. But I will stretch it out to say that when Edwin Sumner and the Union 2nd Corps arrive in the East Woods later on that morning, both Joseph Hooker has now been wounded and Joe Mansfield are gone. And so for Sumner to get reliable information is incredibly difficult. And I think that's going to have huge ramifications for how the rest of the battle plays out on the northern end of the battlefield.
And we've been seeing fighting happening north and south here, but now we're starting to see things shift on the axis more diagonally as the Federals are continuing to press. Dan, I know you have a story as we're getting here into the West Woods that has a personal connection for you. You want to kind of talk about the action there?
Yeah, I think, so just taking it from a broad level, then we'll kind of zero down. The West Woods is the piece of this battle that is left out most often. And I also think that it's one of the key pieces to understanding the broader scale of Antietam. because as Kevin just said, when Edwin Sumner comes on the field with the lead element of the Federal Second Corps, at that point, he is the ranking leading guy on the field, and he has no idea what's been going on. He has not been there. He has not been witnessing any of these events. So he arrives in the East Woods. He sees this Confederate flank that's been battered. Confederates have finally been driven from the cornfield, and he decides, I'm going to take my lead division, John Sedgwick's division. We're going to move right across this battle-strewn ground with thousands of casualties littered across it already. We're going to punch right into that woodlot and try to sweep the Confederate flank. He sees, you see there by the Dunker Church, George Sears Green's division was already holding a small plot of land down there. They were part of the Federal 12th Corps. When Sumner moves into the West Woods, though, with John Sedgwick, this is one of those moments at Antietam where you don't know if Lee's really just that good or really just that lucky, because he happens to have this massive counterattack arriving at exactly the right place at exactly the right time, as you can see circled on the screen there. Thousands of Confederates just slam right into Sedgwick's men, who are in close ranks together in that woodlot. And it's chaos, it's pandemonium. One Union soldier said that all the bullets slamming into trees sounded like there was crackling, like the woods were on fire. You have Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who's caught up in that, part of the 20th Massachusetts, future Supreme Court Justice. He was wounded in the action there. Just so many incredible stories happening. Sedgwick's division loses about half its strength, almost 2,300, 2,400 guys in the span of maybe 30, 40 minutes. And it's comparable to what Pickett's division loses at Gettysburg. It's absolutely stunning with the number of losses in such a short time span. I myself have a personal connection to it. My own ancestor was actually in Sedgwick's division in the 106th Pennsylvania, and he was caught up in the middle of the fighting there. His name was Elwood Rodabaugh. He was a private in the 106 PA. And we know he was killed in action because we have accounts from some of his comrades, accounts saying, he was last seen doing his duty with unflinching bravery. He was caught up in the midst of this melee, last seen trying to retreat along with the men and trying to make a defensive fighting stand at the north end of the woodlot there. And that really was where he was last seen. And he was likely buried as an unknown soldier because he had just shaved off his beard a few days before the battle.
Mm-hmm. So Chris, move us across the battlefield here as we continue to see the action. By the way, Dan, I'm glad that you got here first before your ancestor fell to his poor fate there, by the way. Chris, move us through the battle here.
So with Sumner coming on the field, Sumner, I always question McClellan and his, trust in Sumner. Sumner is the de facto second in command of the Army. He is not exactly who he would want. McClellan would want as his second in command. He is the oldest general in the Union Army on the field. He's also a yes man. He can become focused. His attack in the West Woods has been controversial, as well as what happens next, and that will be moving down, almost simultaneously to the sunken road or the bloody lane. The fighting that you see here on the right hand of the map. The Second Corps. It consists of, for the Federals, 3 divisions. 1 division under Sedgwick will head into the West Woods. The other 2 division commanders following up are told to deploy in the left flank of Sedgwick. Well, as they're moving across the Antietam Creek, it's going to be slow as they do so. There's a lot of rolling hills. So they see the left flank of a division, and that is General Green's division, George Sears Green, and these men start to deploy. Do they think for sure that they're deploying on the proper flank? We don't know. Regardless, what will happen is they're going to move across to Roulette Farm, and as they do so, they will start coming up over top of a hillside. If you've never done this, you need to walk through Roulette Farm towards the sunken road to truly understand what it's going to look like in the shoes of a Union soldier. These soldiers coming under William Blinky French's command, 10 regiments strong, only 3 of the 10 regiments have actually seen action before. As they're marching up over top of this hillside or this crest about 50 yards away, that is whenever they first glimpse the Confederates down inside of a sunken road, and the Confederates will just lay waste to French's attacks. The next division in line that will come up is commanded by Israel Richardson, who will later in the day be mortally wounded and die a few months after the Battle of Antietam. He is going to eventually carry the line at the sunken road, commanded by D.H. Hill's division, specifically Robert Rhodes and George Burgoyne Anderson. This attack down here is probably one of the, if not the most famous outside of the Burnside Bridge in the cornfield. The Confederates will have some miscommunication, some troops will pull out of line with this miscommunication, and the Union Army will exploit that. But the sunken road fight truly is, a decimation to French's division. And a few months later at Fredericksburg, they're going to hit another sunken road, and there it is not going to go well either.
One of the things that always amazed me about this fight too is, of course, the famous photos afterwards, and just how thick the casualties are and how long the Confederates held on under very dire circumstances. Things here get pretty desperate as the fight goes on, and by the time the Federals break through, what's going on for the Confederates at that point, Kevin?
Really, the thing that's, in my opinion, going to break down ultimately the Confederate position in the sunken road is a mixture of confusion amongst all the different commands. You can see in the dark red in this map, moving through the Piper Orchard, Ambrose Wright's brigade of Georgians and Alabamians, Featherston's brigade, Pryor's brigade. That's Richard Anderson's division that's reinforcing D.H. Hill's 2 brigades there in the sunken road. And what is ultimately going to happen is 6 different Confederate brigades are going to be smushed into the sunken road itself, and that's going to create all sorts of confusion. You can imagine that if all 4 of us are in different commands and my commander yells to me that it's time to get out of here and retreat, and you all see these soldiers starting to run to the rear and you're getting shot at from the front, you're going to wonder if that order wasn't for you as well. And so that's one thing that creates this confusion. Of course, additional federal pressure that's being applied in the form of Israel Richardson's division is also putting the Confederates in quite a bind there in the sunken road. But then also command and control is going to start to fall apart. Robert Rhodes, who's commanding the leftmost brigade of D.H. Hill's division, those Alabamians that you see there, is going to be in the rear of his line, caring for a wounded aide of his. The 6th Alabama, holding right there the salient in the road, if you will, under the command of John B. Gordon. Gordon's going to be wounded 5 times. Command passes to a 23-year-old lieutenant colonel by the name of James Lightfoot. Confusion passes through the line. It turns out Rhodes's Alabamians pull out. Most of the North Carolinians and much of R.H. Anderson's division pulls out as well. And ultimately what you're left with by about noon or so is just 2 North Carolina regiments, the 2nd and 14th North Carolina, caught down there in the road. And command confusion had again been a problem for those particular North Carolina units. Earlier in the action, George Anderson received what was thought of as not a very serious wound initially in the ankle. He would ultimately die from it, but command was passed to Colonel Charles II of the 2nd North Carolina, a great scholar, graduated first in his class from the Citadel, founded his own military academy in North Carolina prior to the war. II will go down with a very serious wound. He dies, and so the question really becomes of who is left, and all this extra federal pressure and command and confusion just leads to the Confederate line really melting away by about noon. And as E.P. Alexander wrote of this action, he interpreted it that this was the end of the Confederacy was in sight, he said, when the sunken road position fell.
Great maps by Stephen Stanley of the American Battlefield Trust. I would just want to give a shout out to the Trust for their maps. We've been talking about the action at the north end of the field, but as you guys pointed out earlier, Burnside is starting to stir down at the bridge at the south end of the field. So let's take a look down at the south end of the field there and kind of see as Burnside gets up and moving and is trying to get across the Antietam Creek to join the rest of the army and push McClellan's front down there. Chris, what's going on there at that south end of the field?
So what's happening is a delayed assault. There's some controversy with this. Is it Burnside? Is it McClellan? Regardless of what happens, Burnside is the 9th Army Corps commander, is he, isn't he? Because there's a muddled chain of command down there leading into the campaign. It's a story for another time, but what you're starting to see is that the Ambrose Burnside needs to get across the Antietam Creek, bring his 9th Army Corps, which has arrived up in the Eastern Theater here in late summer and has been attached to the Army of the Potomac starting at 2nd Manassas. He needs to get across the Antietam Creek. Throughout the day, what Robert E. Lee has done is shifted troops from his right to his left, and that is his way to bolster his left flank as well as the center. So by the time Burnside's men start to push forward, you're going to see a very weakened right flank for the Confederates. But as the assaults start to take place, the Union Army is going to send, or Burnside is going to send, Isaac Peace Rodman's division down towards Snavely's Ford to try to find a ford across the creek. You can see here at the bottom. That's going to take hours to locate the ford. Then he is going to send men at the Burnside Bridge. The reason you do this at the Burnside Bridge, where you can see, and I'll annotate it for you, where you see the Twin 51st here, the reason you want to take the Burnside Bridge and not ford the creek is simply put, this is a military crossing. You need to get men, equipment, materials, cannon across this creek as quickly as possible. If you don't have a fordable point along this creek that they're trying to search out, you can't get across it. Steep banks are very difficult to get artillery, men, and horses up across. So what you want to do is try to take that bridge. They're going to try a few different assaults. One is going to miss the bridge completely, charging down over top of a hill, led by George Crook. That's a failure. Another assault will use a farm lane that will run parallel to the creek, but it also runs parallel to the 2nd and 20th Georgia's lines. That is going to meet with disaster. And then you're finally going to have the Twin 51st, as they're eventually called, the 51st PA, 51st New York, come down to the bridge itself and then charge across the 12-foot wide span and eventually dislodging the Confederates. But it's going to take until about 1 o'clock to do so. And at the same time, Rodman's division has found Snavely's Ford and is starting to move up on the Confederate right flank itself. As soon as this happens, the Confederates start to pull back and Burnside starts to move troops across to make that final assault.
So Dan, let me ask you, Burnside gets a lot of flack for not getting across the river sooner. Does he deserve that flack?
I don't think so, because of the difficulty of the situation. He has, as a very good friend of mine, John Hoptak, is fond of saying, he has the toughest job of any corps commander at Antietam for the Union Army. He's the only guy who has to fight his way across the creek, and he has to do so at a 12-foot wide bridge. The Confederates aren't great in number at the bridge. There's only just a couple regiments there, but they are great in their positioning. They have a perfect position to delay the Union attack there for a long while. It really does take him a couple hours to get across the bridge, and I really don't see it being much of a fault of its own. As Chris was telling us a little bit about why you had to take it, I mean, that's pretty spot on. It was an essential crossing point. There was really no way around it if you have all these, the 12,000 men of the 9th Corps. And, once he's across, that's when his real task actually begins. The bridge is immaterial to his real task, not immaterial, but the bridge is not his real task. It is simply a gateway towards the real task, crossing point. The real task is launching that final attack on the Confederate right flank. And by the time that gets underway, maybe 3 o'clock in the afternoon or so, he has some of the most difficult terrain to go across. Again, this time it's not a creek, but it's hills and ridges and valleys that are dipping. And he's having this massive 9th Corps assault go up and over these ridges towards the depleted Confederate right flank on the south end of Sharpsburg there. And it looks like after this full day of the Union Army doing the best they possibly could to batter the Confederates, it looks like they finally had their chance. All day long, Lee had been sending his troops northward, weakening his right flank in favor of his left. And now, in the battle's final hours in the late afternoon of September 17th, Burnside has a chance to really drive into the Confederate right flank toward Sharpsburg. And he's just on the verge of doing it and possibly wiping Lee off the field and giving us a much different view of George McClellan today, except for the arrival of one of McClellan's old West Point classmates, A.P. Hill. And you see him there on the southern edge of the map that Chris is showing us. I think Burnside's overall reputation, it doesn't take into account the difficult terrain, the difficult factors he had, and also the bad luck that he had with Hill arriving exactly at the right place in the right time, of course, after making that lengthy march being the last Confederate division to leave Harper's Ferry after the surrender.
A Hollywood scriptwriter couldn't come up with a tighter script there, with Hill arriving at the right place at the right time. Just kind of in the interest of time here, this effectively ends the fighting on the 17th, and then Lee stays and dares McClellan to attack him on the 18th, which again I think is another bold, gutsy move. What do you guys think about Lee's decision to invite further attack after this single horrific day?
I would say I think it speaks to the attitude he had throughout the campaign, and that Lee, I don't know if I hesitate to use the word desperation, but I think Lee has a sense that timing is everything, and the longer this war goes on, perhaps the odds of Confederate victory go lower and lower as industrial strength and manpower strength of the Union really come to bear. So he knew this campaign, he had to make the most of his chances, and he did not know when he was going to come back up into the northern states again. I would say it's a similar philosophy to what fuels his decision-making on July 3rd at Gettysburg.
Kevin, bold or foolish?
I think it was in some ways really Lee's only chance that he had. I think Lee was faced with the real problem of trying to get his army back across the Potomac River in one night without any preparation on the 17th. And so I think Lee felt almost that he had no other choice. But I think it does, as Dan mentioned, show the stakes that Lee had waged on this campaign. And even on September 18th, Lee was not done trying to figure out a way to regain the initiative and declare Antietam a Confederate victory. And so I think Lee was really faced with the fact that he would not go back into Virginia unless he had absolutely no other option. He was still exploring those options on the 18th, and by the night of the 18th, he decided it was time to get out.
And he's actually considering just going across the river, going upriver, and then crossing back into Maryland and continuing the campaign at this point, correct?
Yes, yep, that's correct. Lee writes it 3 separate times, and that was very clearly his plan. I've mentioned this to many people, and they all tell me that Lee was crazy for doing it, and I think, yeah, probably he was, but that doesn't mean he didn't try it. And ultimately he did. So Lee wanted the campaign to continue after withdrawing from Sharpsburg. And
I'm amazed that I still think there's like a great deal of contempt for McClellan in Lee's decision to stay there too. Kevin, I want to pitch it over to you real quick. We're running out of time, but I want you to talk about Shepherdstown. You've got a great book about Shepherdstown, a very important and overlooked aspect of this campaign, the final sort of action of the battle. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, Chris has the map pulled up here. Shepherdstown is a 2-day engagement. The only retreat route or route back across the Potomac River into Virginia, what's now West Virginia, that Lee has is about a mile downstream from Shepherdstown at Boatler's Ford. Lee will get his entire army across by the morning of September 19th. McClellan will pursue initially with Alfred Pleasanton's cavalry and then elements of the 6th Corps first, and then Fitzjohn Porter's 5th Corps will arrive. Porter sends a storming party across to scatter Lee's rear guard, which consists of 44 artillery pieces and about 600 infantry under the command of William Nelson Pendleton. Pendleton's command is scattered by Porter's dusk charge across the Potomac River, and Pendleton rides back throughout the night to find Robert E. Lee. And when he finds Lee, this is probably the first instance that Lee has had to get a good night's rest in a matter of almost a week at this point. And Pendleton tells Lee that a Union force of unknown size has crossed the Potomac River, and they have captured all 44 guns of the artillery reserve. And Lee simply could stammer all, and Pendleton replies, "Yes, General, I fear all." And so Lee has to put the brakes on his movement upriver to recross his army at Williamsport into Maryland and keep his campaign alive. Lee turns back about 3/4 of his army back toward Shepherdstown. The morning of September 20th, Fitzjohn Porter sends a reconnaissance in force across the river. It gets caught by A.P. Hill's division, once again in the van of Lee's army. And the Federals are actually, for the most part, able to make it across relatively unscathed, with the exception of the 118th Pennsylvania, which was a brand new regiment, one of these many brand new regiments in the Union Army at this point. The Pennsylvanians will lose close to 40% of their men in action there. And the Battle of Shepherdstown, again, a 2-day battle, will end with about 7,000 casualties and about 10,000 men engaged. So it's still to this day, in terms of men killed or wounded, the bloodiest battle in West Virginia in the Civil War.
So, Chris, let me pitch things back to you as we try to wrap things up here now. What's the big takeaway now that the dust starts to settle after the Battle of Antietam?
William Nelson Pendleton's one of the worst officers in the Confederate Army. But that's for another time. I've always found it interesting that, the 6th and 5th Corps really were the two favorites of George McClellan. Looking at this, Fitzjohn Porter and William Franklin were both hand-selected by George McClellan to become Corps commanders. With Fitzjohn Porter being so heavily engaged at 2nd Manassas as well as Peninsula, he was the most experienced Corps commander under McClellan, and without him actively engaged at Antietam, I think that was a disadvantage for McClellan because he's his most trusted subordinate. And he's his most experienced at Corps level, and he's shown time and time again that he can handle troops in combat. Say what you will for his alleged court-martial and his alleged actions at 2nd Manassas. Fitzjohn Porter, even though he's a McClellan man, he's a heck of a good Corps commander. But to your point, Chris, very quickly, the Confederates, at this point are now given time to lick their wounds. George McClellan at this point is going to pretty much sit down proud as a peacock and say, hey, we've driven them out. I've got this grand victory. It's a perfect victory. And Lincoln will come out to Antietam to meet with his Army commander in a way to try to prod him to start going down across the Potomac River, which I think shocks McClellan. McClellan's got this victory as he sees it, this major victory. He's driven Robert E. Lee off of Maryland soil, but now Lee's army is able to put itself back together. And by late November, the numbers of the Confederates are now back up to 78,000 plus in the Army of Northern Virginia. And George McClellan's teetering on the brink of being relieved of command for his good friend, Ambrose Burnside. The army that was being built by McClellan in Washington that comes out here to fight at Antietam is also going to start having better trained men getting into it. You'll have more units coming in from this emergency of 1862. That is the emergency of Lee pushing north towards Washington during July, August, and September. And those new units coming down 9-month and 3-year regiments will start to be folded into the Army. This Army will be properly organized, which is a good thing. But without the pressure to keep Lee on the ropes, I think Lincoln has finally had it with McClellan. But could McClellan, like George McClellan George Meade after Gettysburg, really do this? I don't think so. I think it would be very tough to keep this campaign moving. I think that both sides are exhausted, and he's lost a number of Corps commanders just like George Gordon Meade had. I think the Confederates are given time, rightfully so, because McClellan has to give them the time to reorganize his army. But I think the public persona of George McClellan was a little too much for Abraham Lincoln.
Dan, one of the things that I love about your book, That Field of Blood, is you just flat out say this is a Union victory. And, memory tends to have interpreted this as a draw, but it's clearly a Union victory. Tell me a little bit about that and why.
Well, Chris, let me put it this way. If I describe a battle for you, you tell me whether it's Antietam or Gettysburg. Confederate Army comes into Union soil fresh off of victories, momentum on their side. Union Army is in kind of a disarray. Commanders being assigned all over the place, playing catch up. The armies collide together. A terribly bloody battle is fought. At the end of the fighting, both armies are still on the field, and the Confederates withdraw and get back to Virginia. Is that Antietam or is that Gettysburg? Yeah,
question. Either, right?
I think we have to describe Antietam as a victory, simply because we would be rejecting the same rubric we used to describe Gettysburg as a victory. Albeit at Gettysburg, it was the Federal Army on the defense, Confederate attacking, and it's vice versa at Antietam. I think that at Antietam, McClellan accomplishes his objectives of keeping Confederates away from Washington, D.C. and pushing them out of Union territory. Robert E. Lee does not accomplish his objectives for the campaign. Strategically, it's a Union victory. I think you can argue tactically that the Federal Army has pretty big gains across the field on the 17th. If we're going to judge battles as victories based on whether or not an army was destroyed, you'd have maybe a handful of victories in the American Civil War, and everything else would be a tactical draw. So I think it's a Union victory, but don't take my word for it. Abraham Lincoln thought it was a victory too.
Uh, as evidenced by the fact that just a couple days after the battle, he is going to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a game changer in the war if there ever was one. We're going to save that as a topic for a future video chat and discussion. So I don't want to open that can of worms because we're running out of time, and that is a huge, and hugely important discussion. I just want to throw it back to each of you for any final thoughts before we leave the banks of Antietam Creek. Kevin, I want to start with you. Final thoughts.
I think for one thing, if people wanted to take away one or two things about this, it's of course important to remember that really one of America's darkest days, bloodiest single day in American military history, leads ultimately to one of its brightest days with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Dan, I'm seeing you nod your head there in agreement. Something you want to add about that?
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it, Kevin. Antietam not only had its tactical and strategic consequences, it had this vast ability to reshape the country and the world as we know it, simply because it led to the Emancipation Proclamation, which Horace Greeley said was the beginning of the end of the rebellion, the beginning of a new life for the nation. And I think rarely in history do you see a single battle with such a direct impact on such a large event such as emancipation. But ultimately, it's that human toll, the human casualties of Antietam, 23,000 plus killed, wounded, missing in 12 hours of combat. My own life has been shaped by it because of the story of my great-great-great-grandfather. I always would tell, when I worked at Antietam as a ranger and a guide, I would tell visitors that my great-great-great-grandfather is proof that one person and one story can change the world, because it did for me.
Chris, final thoughts.
Since we went down the emancipation road, I will say that the one misconception that I always see from Antietam, especially at this time, from the average visitor, is that the Union war effort is failing in September of 1862. It is not. The Confederates have taken the operational initiative in the East away, and even in the West a little bit, but the victory after victory in the Western theater, at Shiloh, Forts Henry, Donelson, New Orleans, Nashville's fallen, Memphis has fallen. The Southern Confederacy is falling in upon itself. And this is Lee having to go for broke for bigger and better things. And even Abraham Lincoln will say, to paraphrase him as he talks to a French diplomat, things I wish that people would focus on the West a little bit more, because we have so many great victories out there, but they focus here on the East. That's where the population center was. Antietam is an absolutely important victory, followed up quickly by the Union victory at Perryville, which is really going to push back that high tide of the Confederacy in 1862 and potentially, of the war. This is really the last big hurrah where you have this coordinated effort going north with these two major armies.
I promised us the opportunity today to get into the weeds, and we did some, but the thing that I'm taking away from tonight's discussion kind of goes back to Kevin's comment earlier. You can spend 3 hours in the cornfield and still not cover it all. So many weeds that we could still get into, such a rich amount of history that this battle lends itself to. I want to urge you to, again, take a look at that Field of Blood by Dan. Great overview of the battle itself, and Kevin's co-authored book with Rob Orison, To Hazard All, which is a great driving tour of different components of the Maryland campaign that ties in a lot with the Civil War trails. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for the opportunity to chat with you guys tonight and talk a little bit about Antietam. Dan Vermilya, Kevin Pawlak, Kris White, thank you all so much. I'm Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.